My apologies. So last lesson, or I guess 2 lessons ago, technically, Jesus told of His death. He clearly told of His death. That's the end of chapter 16. From that time, there it goes again. From that time, Jesus began to show His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things. Now, I don't know if you've thought about it being ironic that with that great confession was really probably the high point of the apostles' faith. You'll rarely see it get back up to that level. And as Peter made that confession, you might think that would be the point when Jesus would start to talk about the glory that was coming. You know, isn't that a big moment that here this revelation that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is like a breakthrough moment when Jesus could really start to talk about all this great stuff to go along with that. But instead, that's the moment when Jesus chose to start telling them clearly, or showing them clearly, that He was going to die. So, right after this, Jesus and the apostles, 3 of them, go up onto this mountain where something's going to happen to Him. We call it the Transfiguration. Somebody want to turn to 1 John chapter 3, verse 2, please? That'll give me a chance to mess with this. If I throw it down really hard, it might work. That's the old way. The old trick that used to fix everything. Just give it a nice healthy smack and it starts working again. John 3, verse 2, if somebody wants to read it.
Have you ever wondered how the apostles knew that it was Moses and Elijah?
We'll get to that. Think about that. John says, "Beloved, we're God's children now. And what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when He appears, we shall be like Him, because we shall see Him as He is." We are children of God right now, God's children. What will we be? Well, that goes back to one of the things that Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 15, how we'll have a new body of sorts, not a brand new body, but our bodies will be changed. We don't really know what we're going to be. At least, we don't know exactly how it's going to be. But he makes this interesting statement. When Jesus appears, we're going to be like Him, because we will see Him as He is. Isn't that fascinating? What does that mean? We're going to see Him as He is. Now, John, the apostle, wrote this, and hasn't John seen Jesus before? Well, yeah, he saw Him quite a bit. In fact, he's one of the ones that were on this mountain here. So what do you think John meant when he said, we'll see Him as He is? Just think about that as we look at this situation here, this event. Matthew 17, 1 through 3 says, "After 6 days, Jesus took with Him Peter and James and John, His brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And He was transfigured before them. And His face shone like the sun, and His clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Okay. This is what we're going to be discussing. We'll talk about several questions, related to this. Richard brought up one of them. Some head-scratching moments here that some of them we don't really have the answer to. We can speculate. We can reason maybe some. But I want to impress on our minds that idea that I mentioned at the beginning there, that here they reach this huge high moment. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, just as plain as day. Peter said it, speaking for the others. High point in their faith. And then it's followed immediately by Jesus saying, now that you know that that's who I am and are not afraid to say it and understand for the most part that I am the Messiah of God, the Christ of God, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and be killed. But then I'm going to rise again on the third day. Clearly, Peter's declaration of who Jesus was, his faith or understanding wasn't strong enough for that statement to not bother him. Because that's when he said, no, that's not going to happen to you. That will not happen. We will not let that happen. And it's almost as if that wilderness temptation was being replayed. If you think about it, what Peter did is very similar to what the devil did to Jesus in the wilderness about, we can do this another way. You don't have to go to the cross. I'll give you all the kingdoms of the whole world. And all you have to do is pledge your allegiance to me. That may be why Jesus called Peter Satan on that occasion, although Satan does mean adversary. But it was very similar to the temptation that the devil, one of the temptations the devil presented him with. So this was a very good time, a perfect time for this event that we're looking at tonight to happen. And the first thing that Matthew says is that it was after 6 days. Luke's is a little bit different. Okay? Anybody know what Luke's account says? Okay, about 8 days. Great word, about, in this usage. Approximately 8 days. So Matthew says 6 days. Luke says about 8 days. We'll call it 7. About 7. 7 is about 8, isn't it? 6 is about 8 for that matter. But we don't know anything that happened during these 6 days, 6 to 8 days. But we can't help but assume and think that it was probably filled with teaching. Jesus, again, that verse 21 of chapter 16, from that time Jesus began to show them. Surely during this week-long interval, Jesus was doing that. He was explaining, instructing, teaching them, trying to get them to understand what He was here to do. Yes, He was here to build His church, establish His kingdom, all the same thing, which He already said He was going to do. But they needed to understand that there was an even bigger mission, if I may call it bigger, that must be done as well. And they needed, probably after being told about this, maybe for their faith to be rekindled a little bit, their worry maybe to be alleviated. They needed to see the power of Jesus and the glory of Jesus maybe in a new and different way, which is exactly what was going to happen. So after about 6 days, Jesus took 3 of the apostles, the 3 inner circle as we call them, Peter and James and John. John, the brother of James. Peter, James, and John. This is the second of the 3 times when Peter, James, and John were exclusively chosen. The one we've already seen was Jairus' daughter in the room of Jairus' daughter when he raised her from the dead. The third was going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew 26. But why do you think those 3 were chosen? On this occasion or on any occasion, but maybe this one most of all. Wouldn't this be important for all of them to see? What do you think?
Peter and James, well, and John, that's a little bit at all, kind of showed that they have pretty magnanimous personalities. And so maybe it's because of the influence that they have with the other apostles, that once it clicks with them, they'll be kind of able to help the others understand it better.
Yeah, could be.
Seem to be leaders.
Yeah, they definitely were leaders of sorts. Yeah, they weren't, above the others in a way, but they definitely led. They were definitely leaders, and that's why Jesus, even in the other instances when he didn't take only them, we see them, coming forward, standing out a little bit more than the others. So their example would be important for the others. I guess maybe a better question is, why didn't Jesus take the others? Maybe more than why did he take these three? Why didn't he take the others? We don't know. He had his reasons, and his reasons are good. We know he had a reason. This is not something that you would do without reason, because it would seem natural to us for them all to be up there and to see this. So we don't know for sure, but all we know is that he did. So he takes these three up there.
He also tells them that not to tell anyone until after he has already ascended.
Yeah.
So maybe he trusted them more to be able to hold that.
Uh-huh. And we would think this would be something that they would need to tell the others immediately. Don't you think they'd wonder what was going on up there? What did he say? What'd you do? What were you doing up there? And they're like, sorry, can't tell you. And it may be, not to get ahead of ourselves, even they didn't, Elijah being there really threw them for a loop. And their confusion was based on the same view that all the Jews had, because the scribes were teaching that about Elijah. So for them to go and start spreading this, we could see how that would very quickly and easily turn into a big mess of confusion about what was happening and why, and what Elijah's role was going to be in it, and so on and so forth. So for whatever reason, Jesus took only these three, and for whatever reason, he was going to tell them to keep this quiet for a time, until he had already been raised from the dead. So when they were up there on a high mountain by themselves, there's the next thing. He took them up on a high mountain. Which mountain? Don't know, don't care. To be frank, doesn't matter. Doesn't make a bit of difference. They're obviously different people are going to have different views. There's probably going to be difficulties with any interpretation. But Mount Hermon seems to be the most popular belief, and the fact that it was located near Caesarea Philippi certainly fits in with the context and where they were at this time. But what is important is not necessarily who he took or where he took them or how long, at what point he took them, but what happened when they were there. And what the text says is that he was transfigured. Now, if it weren't for the Bible, if it weren't for the New Testament, and you having heard about this before, and this is the first time you've ever read Matthew 17, you would likely have no clue what in the world that is. Because that's not a word you use or read every day. He was transfigured? What does that even mean? Well, thankfully, in addition to, scholars, Greek scholars and of the original languages and things like that, we get go ahead and get a depiction of what it means. It says, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. So there's a definition or an explanation of what it means that he was transfigured. He was shining. He was glowing. Literally. His clothes became white. What color were they before? I don't know. But they weren't white. Now they were. They were white as light. If you were having a little camp out or something with somebody, a group of your friends, and one of them started shining like a light, you are going to be very disturbed. And this is, what have they gotten into some sort of radiation? What is happening here? This is not normal. Am I dreaming? That would probably be the first thing. Is this even real? Well, this is what was happening. And the Greek word that's used there, if I can just pull it up exactly here, is a word that may sound even more familiar than the word transfigured. The Greek word is metamorphao. If you've ever heard the word metamorphosis. Have you ever heard that word? The English word? Metamorphosis? In what connection have you heard that word before? Okay, a caterpillar and a butterfly. That process, when it gets itself all wrapped up in the cocoon and whatever, and when it comes out of that cocoon, it's a totally, we would, to the naked eye, totally different creature. Of course, we know it's not. This is just the natural process. But something took place in that. It was a total transformation. That's the word, where we get that word metamorphosis comes from this Greek word that is translated transfigured in the ESV. It's translated transformed in some, but generally transfigured is the way it's translated. So that's where we get that word. So transformed is a way to understand that. But he wasn't totally transformed. But he looked different. He didn't look like a normal human being. To change in a manner visible to others is what that Greek word means. In fact, it's the same word that Paul uses in Romans 12:2 when he says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed. Although he means it in a spiritual sense, obviously. So Jesus takes them up there, and at this point we know that it's very obvious the reason that he took them up there was for this. This was the plan. But what is even more shocking than Jesus starting to look like a flashlight is 2 additional men show up out of nowhere. Not really out of nowhere, out of somewhere, but they weren't there before. And they weren't just anybody. They weren't a couple of anonymous nobodies. These were some bigwigs. Moses and Elijah appeared to them. So notice, Jesus was transfigured before them, and there appeared to them Moses and Elijah. So Peter, James, and John were seeing all of this. They were witnessing this. Both what happened to Jesus and Moses and Elijah. Now, it doesn't say that Moses and Elijah showed up talking to Jesus, but they didn't see them. They appeared to them. So all of this was for them to see, and I think ultimately we would know the reason was for them to see it was not only for their own good, but ultimately for our good as well, because they were going to record it even though they couldn't tell anybody at first. So, verse 3 says in Matthew 17, Moses and Elijah appeared, and they were talking with Jesus. But Matthew, and if I'm not mistaken, Mark, neither tells us what they were talking about. Just that they were talking with him. And we might think, well, there's no sense in wondering, because if they wanted us to know what they were talking about, they would have told us. However, Luke does tell us what they were talking about. Luke tells us what they were talking about. Luke chapter 9 and verse, let's see here, 31. I'll just read verse 30 as well. Behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, the ESV says, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, even without looking at anything else about the word that's translated departure in the ESV, whenever we see that last phrase, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem, and we connect that with what he had just started to show them. What was it that he had began at that point to show them was going to happen? Where? Yeah, he's going to go to Jerusalem and be killed. Well, now, without any further investigation, it's easy to see that connection. What he's about to accomplish at Jerusalem was his death. Departure. Any of your versions say something different if you turned over to Luke 9:31? Decease, okay? The word is the word exodos. That word probably sounds familiar because it sounds an awful lot like Exodus. And the reason it sounds a lot like Exodus is because it pretty much is. Now, what is an Exodus? What is the book of Exodus about? It's about Israel's Exodus. Duh. Well, what is that? Okay, they went from one place, they went to another place. Sometimes we might call that a departure, which is why the ESV translates it that way, and that is more an accurate way. The other translation just sort of takes that another step. They're talking about his death, his decease, when he's going to depart the world. But that's what they were talking about, and that is one of the most intriguing and fascinating things to think about. Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus about Jesus' death that who was about to accomplish? The Jews? The Romans? He was about to accomplish it. That's not insignificant. That's very important. That's very important. He was going to accomplish it, which he was telling them over and over, I'm doing this. I'm laying down my life willingly. What would Moses and Elijah know about Jesus' death? Okay, everything. Well, now that, where were Moses and Elijah, by the way? Where'd they come from? They came from an otherworldly place, literally. They came from the place of the realm of the dead, as we would call it, Hades, paradise. Elijah never died, remember? He was taken up. Moses died and was buried. Elijah never died. But they died, or they were taken from the earth a long, long, long time ago, before this. Somewhere, between 12 and, both of them, between 12 and 1,500 years earlier. Now, or at least 1,000 to 1,500 years earlier. Now they probably knew everything they could know, that anybody could know. When they were alive on the earth, they didn't know anything about it. We can only assume. They just got these bits and pieces of God putting it together, and in their time it wasn't put together very much. Now we can only assume their knowledge was fulfilled, to an extent. So here they are, these big, huge characters of extreme importance to the Jewish people, the Israelites, talking with Jesus. Now, they already knew that Jesus was special, and he belonged in special company. Just like an athlete at any given time in his or her prime, they're going to be in the Hall of Fame one day. and people talk about them, in the same sentence as the greats that are in the Hall of Fame. They're not in the Hall of Fame yet, but they're going to be. They would think of Jesus. They know that He is even greater than anybody, but they may not still be able to help but think of these Moses and Elijah a little bit differently, just because they had grown up always reading about them, admiring them, and all this, and Jesus was with them. So even though they knew Jesus was even greater, it's still different, like Jesus Himself said, that a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown and in his own household even. It's difficult for man to get over that, the way people view those that have already gone on or have always been admired in that way. So this puts Jesus in very special company. Moses, Elijah, Jesus. Now, I'm speaking in terms of how they would have viewed this, not meaning to downgrade Jesus or anything. But what's interesting, like Richard mentioned earlier, well, actually, we have to read a little bit further before we even establish this. Verse 4, Matthew 17, verse 4 says, "And Peter said to Jesus," surprise, surprise, "Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I'll make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Mark's account says, Mark 9:5, Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Pretty much the same. Luke's account says in Luke 9:32, "Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep." See, we didn't know this yet. We didn't know this from the others. They had been sleeping. Now, they were fully awake. I don't know about you, but it takes me a while to get fully awake. Coffee usually helps. But if you wake up and your eyes are heavy and then you see shining Jesus, that's going to wake you up. But then when you see Moses and Elijah, that's really going to wake you up. Now, Peter, it says, when they became fully awake, they saw His glory and the 2 men who stood with Him. And as the men were parting from Him, there's another detail we didn't get from the others. As the men were parting from Him, I'd like to know what that looked like, by the way. Were they walking away like normal people would? Like, "See you later, Jesus, we better get going." Or were they floating away? I don't know. But they were leaving, and Peter perceived that they were leaving. And this is when he spoke up. "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." Now this is my favorite part. Not knowing what he said is what the ESV says. Luke adds that little tidbit in there. If I'm not mistaken, some of the other ones are word that a little bit differently. And I'm not seeing it here. Let me see. Not knowing what he said. Not knowing what he said. Not knowing what he was saying. Anybody say anything different? Not realizing what he was saying. Well, it's close enough. I was thinking there was one that worded it a little bit differently, more like he didn't know what to say. But I might be getting confused with another place. Anyway, he didn't know what he was saying. He didn't understand the implication of what he was saying, is probably the meaning there, based on that wording at least.
The New American Standard, verse 6, Mark 9 says, "He did not know what to answer."
Okay, maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Okay, yeah, you're right. Thank you. It's Mark's account that includes that, not the last statement in Luke 9:33, but the next verse in Mark's account says, "For he did not know what to say." That's what he said, because he didn't know what to say. And we've talked about that concept before, if you don't know what to say. But what he said, he didn't have any bad intentions or anything. He didn't mean it disrespectful to Jesus. He didn't think about or understand the implication of what he had just suggested. Now, I guess we sort of have to speculate what he may have been suggesting accidentally in the first place. And usually, based on what's about to happen, I think the general understanding is he was putting Jesus on a level playing field, or a level with these other two men by suggesting this. I'll just be frank, I'm not so sure that is what the implication would have been. It seems, whatever it was, and that very well could be what it was, Peter, he said this hastily because he saw that they were leaving. And just like you and I would feel, he didn't want that to happen. You don't want this kind of thing to end. I don't want them to leave. Moses and Elijah are here. Now, to Richard's question or comment, how in the world did they know that was Moses and Elijah? Because like I already said, they had been dead or gone at least 1,000 years, more like 1,000 to 1,500 years. They had obviously never seen each other before. How did Peter know that was Moses and Elijah? And we have to assume that he did, because it's not like after they wrote it, they filled in the blanks instead of saying, why don't we build 3 tents, one for you and one for these other 2 guys? And then after the fact, they filled in that it was Moses and Elijah. This is a quote. This is what Peter said. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. How did they know that was Moses and Elijah? Well, there are only a few possibilities, aren't there? One of them is that they had name tags on. Could have. Doubt it, but could have. That's one way to know somebody's name that you've never met before. That is the purpose of the name tag. That is the literal purpose of the invention of the name tag. Is so you know somebody's name that you don't know. Otherwise, they wouldn't need a name tag. But other than that, what do you think? How would they know?
They would have addressed each other by name.
Okay, they could have heard them say their names.
By the content of the topic.
Yeah, maybe it was what they were talking about, or what some of the things they were saying. Yeah, God could have revealed it. Yeah. So maybe as they were talking, Moses said, yeah, I remember back whenever I led the Israelites out of Egypt. And Peter thought, oh, that must be Moses, because I know Moses is the one that did that. And, Elijah said, yeah, back whenever I was taken away by the chariots of fire, and that must be Elijah. Probably not the way it worked out, but maybe they heard Jesus say their names, like, good point, Moses, and, Elijah, what do you think? And wow, there's Moses and Elijah. I'm inclined to think the way they knew who they were was not anything natural or obvious, but the same way that in the account or the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, he knew that Abraham was Abraham, and Jesus, even if we view that as a parable, which I'm inclined to do, doesn't mean that it's not true, quite the opposite. But Jesus depicted that man as knowing who Abraham was. But anyway, the way that they knew who Moses and Elijah was is the same way that we will know who people are on the other side. Now, that may not be the best answer, because it's not really an answer, but it's still the truth. We will know who other people are. And this is one of the indications of that. This shows that. And by the way, in this instance, even though Elijah never died, we're talking about 2 men Moses at least, you know where Moses' body was? In the ground somewhere. Nobody knows, but it's in the ground. He died on that mountain, and he was buried. Satan and Michael know, because we learn later, talk about a head scratcher, that they were fighting over it. No clue what in the world's going on in that verse. But his body, the point is, he didn't have his body. He was outside of his body. And yet he was Moses. And he looked like Moses. And he looked like a man. And he was a man. There were two men with Jesus talking. They were men. They were not just men, but they were them. They were who they were on the earth in life. They were themselves. They looked like themselves. They spoke like themselves. They had knowledge. They were able to think. They were them. And anything that we can draw from Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration can only be a preview of what it is like whenever we leave the earth. They were still themselves. Their identity had continued. They were still men. They were still human beings. And so on and so forth. Even in the intermediate state, as it's called sometimes. Now, we know that in eternity, our spirits will be reunited with our bodies and then they'll be changed. But in this state, they are without their bodies. At least, I don't know how it works with Elijah and slipped my mind, Enoch. But for everybody else who did die first, they are without their bodies. And Paul talks about them being naked. Samuel's another example. Whenever that instance when Saul needed to talk to him, never listened to him when he was alive, but now that he's dead, he needed to talk to him. And God made him appear to this witch and Saul. And it was Samuel. Saul knew Samuel, and he recognized Samuel, and Samuel was Samuel even after he died. So, and he knew Samuel, recognized him. And think about that verse back that we read at the beginning, 1 John 3:2. When Jesus was killed and then he rose from the dead, he still looked like Jesus, sounded like Jesus, walked like Jesus, talked like Jesus, smelled like Jesus. He was Jesus. As he himself said, "Look at me and see that it is I myself." So,
Some didn't recognize him.
What's that?
Some didn't recognize him as they walked along after that.
There were two that didn't, and we kind of get the impression after that plays out that the reason they didn't is because there was something they were prevented from recognizing him until he wanted them to, and then, sadly for them, the moment he wanted them to was when he left. So then they realized, hey, that was Jesus. They didn't recognize him before, and just so many questions we have that we don't have the answer to. But it's still important that John says we will be like him. And the only way that statement makes any sense is to go back and look at Jesus, post-resurrection Jesus, and collect whatever information we can about that. But here, Moses and Elijah were far from that point that John referred to about we will be like him when he appears. But they were leaving. Peter said this. He didn't know what to say. He didn't realize what he was saying. They were all terrified, naturally. Still can't help but notice that all the other two were terrified, but they didn't say anything. But Peter was terrified, and he did say something, and now he gets in trouble again. Because what happened next was a cloud, a bright cloud, what some of the versions might say in Matthew's account. A bright cloud. You ever seen a bright cloud before? I never have, to be honest. I've seen a light cloud, on a blue, bright day. The clouds might look like big cotton balls. I don't know if I'd call it bright, so I don't really know what a bright cloud is. And it's nighttime. So whatever this thing was, a cloud, this fog, you ever been up in the mountains somewhere where you actually are in the cloud and it doesn't feel like what you see up in the sky, but you know that's what it is. This one was bright. I don't know if it was literally shining like Jesus was shining, but it came and overshadowed them. All three versions say that, and according to the English Standard Version at least, this cloud came and overshadowed them. Maybe totally encompassed them. Now, if they were scared before, now they're really scared. And if just when they think they can't get any more scared, the next thing happens. A voice came out of the cloud and said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." I actually kind of like the shorter versions in Mark and Luke. "This is my Son. This is my chosen one. Listen to him." Now, in the context of what Peter had just suggested, what is the implication or significance of that statement coming from the cloud? We know whose voice it was because it's revealed in what he said.
Don't worry about keeping Moses and Elijah around. What Jesus has to say is what you need to listen to.
Yeah. You don't worry about Moses and Elijah.
Stop trying to impress them.
Yeah, maybe. Stop trying to impress Moses and Elijah. Quit sucking up to Moses and Elijah,
You know, you said a few minutes ago that they would have grown up having learned of Moses and Elijah and all the stories and everything. Well, they actually had been reading and learning about Jesus for all this time too. They just didn't understand that the man before them was who they'd been learning about.
Yeah.
Even though Peter had made that confession. Kind of like when he said, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's possible that Peter was kind of at that point. He had made the confession, but still didn't have full grasp.
Yeah. I think that's only natural. Even though they knew, it's still difficult for the mind to process that this man in front of me, this man that we've been with, this man that is our teacher, that we're with 24/7, is to put everything they knew and thought about the Messiah with Jesus. Here he is. That will be very difficult to do in real time at that moment. Not just at that moment, at all. And, I don't think it's incidental or coincidental that it was not until after Jesus was not there with them anymore that they got it. And, of course, the Holy Spirit helped with that, but still, it's almost as if when he was with them, they really struggled. Now he needed to be with them, and there were things that needed to happen that could only happen with him being with them. But this voice was the Father, obviously, because he says, "This is my Son, my chosen one. You listen to him." Moses and Elijah were great. They played their part, and their part's over. Now, very quickly, they fell down. Now they're truly terrified. Fell on their faces. They're trembling with their faces down in the dirt. They don't want to look up. But Jesus came and he touched them and he said, "It's okay. Don't fear. It's just me." And they looked up and they looked around and they saw nobody but Jesus only. Jesus alone. That's a significant statement too, even though I think it just means literally they looked up and they only saw Jesus. But that was sort of the point, wasn't it? Jesus only. Don't worry about Moses and Elijah. Jesus is who is important, and the Father, the voice from the cloud would tell them that. Now, as they're walking down the mountain, they were confused. Whoops. I'll go ahead and skip through that because the last thing was on there already. They didn't understand. They were talking about Elijah. They couldn't. They were tripping over Elijah being there, or not really that he was there, but that he wasn't there. Why were they confused about that? Why did Elijah leaving throw them for a loop? Okay. Verse 10, Matthew 17. Then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? Now, I think the key phrase there is the scribes say. The Old Testament says what it said, but the scribes were teaching that Elijah was literally going to come. So they were interpreting Malachi's prophecy literally, that Elijah, before the great day of Jehovah comes, the kingdom comes, Elijah's going to come back. Now, this helps to explain why Elijah was one of the people that some were saying Jesus was. But they were confused, and this was a very good question for them to ask at this point. And he says, Elijah does come. And he will restore all things. It seems to be future tense. However, and I think he's saying that in terms of the what Malachi prophesied. In other words, what Malachi said is fully intact and has not changed. But he says, I tell you, he's already come. Elijah has come already. And they didn't recognize him. But they did to him whatever they pleased. And so in that same way, the Son of Man will suffer at their hands. And that statement, they understood. He was talking about John the Baptizer. So here is Jesus confirming that John the Baptizer was the fulfillment of Malachi's prophecy that I will send Elijah the prophet. Now, somebody might say, the prophecy does not say we're going to send somebody like Elijah. I'm going to send somebody that's going to have a ministry that's an appearance and form that it resembles Elijah. But he says, I'll send Elijah. Well, back in the prophecy or the promise of his coming in the early chapters of the gospel, Luke's account again says that John the Baptizer came in the spirit and power of Elijah. He would come in the spirit and power of Elijah. That's what it means. That's the connection. John came in the spirit and power of Elijah. He wasn't Elijah. He wasn't him reborn or anything. He was his own individual person, but he came in the spirit and power of Elijah. And that prophecy of Malachi was talking about John. And Jesus himself confirms that right there. And they clicked with them more quickly than these things usually did. You know, a lot of times a statement like that would leave them scratching their heads. And they'd have to get further explanation. But this, they knew that he's talking about John. John was the fulfillment of Elijah, the prophecy of Elijah coming. So from that moment, that was a huge moment for their understanding of the whole plan of God, because they had, up until this point, and they were in their 30s, late 20s, early 30s, they had believed that Elijah was going to come before the kingdom came. Now they, all of a sudden, just like that, they've been hit with a ton of bricks. That's wrong. The Old Testament never said that's going to happen, and it's not going to happen, so they would no longer be looking for that. They would understand that that has already happened in the coming and ministry of John the Baptizer, preparing the way for Jesus. So that was a very crucial moment for their understanding. Still had a lot of pieces to put together, but that was one that was very well solved, and they would have needed to understand that. So even though they weren't going to tell anybody about what they had seen, I bet they went and told their brethren down there about this at least. Hey, guess what? John the Baptizer was Elijah. The prophecy about Elijah, that phase or whatever has come and gone. And so we're really nearing anything that they attributed to the appearance of Elijah, like that's going to be a big day because then the kingdom's almost here. They're in that moment now because John's already dead. And now they know it's about to happen. And just like Jesus had just told them, I'm going to build my church. But it also means that something else is about to happen that they have not yet been prepared themselves to accept, and that is that Jesus is going to be killed. And they still haven't made peace with that, and they won't until after He's already raised from the dead, even after He died. And even after they see the empty tomb, they still didn't get it. That would have been the moment we might think they finally get it, like, wow, He's really gone. Just like He said, but they still didn't get it. And so it would take a while, but they were getting there, and we can relate to that, I think.
Maybe they didn't really get it until after He ascended because the angel said, "What are you looking at?"
Yeah, after they saw the empty tomb, and they're like, the angel had to tell them, go to Galilee. Didn't He tell you that's where He's going to be? Go on, get going. Scram. Oh, but how often are we so slow to understand or to accept something that goes against our instinct or whatever?
That's true, but the Jews were accustomed to the miraculous. They grew up believing and they knew what God could do and was capable of, and they still struggle with it. Like,
Yeah.
They were comfortable with the miraculous, and it was still hard for them to understand.
Yep. When you actually see it, So we can't really say too much about them because
We have written proof
mm-hmm.
from all those people, and we still have trouble.
Yeah, we've got written record from these men that saw it, just like we didn't get to it, but in 2 Peter 1, Peter says, we saw the glory of the power of God, the power of Christ, the glory, the majesty, and they saw a lot of other things too and have told us, and we struggle to accept it and receive it.
But that's why it takes study to open your eyes of faith and the heart. We have a tendency to see everything through humanness, through our eyes. And at least back then, like when he went to Acts, they had gods for everything. They had seen power, but they had no real explanation for anything. And so you can't blame them for tending to go towards the physical and forcing that when we have the same tendencies. I find it, I was thinking, I was reading the worship of the Old Testament and how every physical sin, the smell, the sight of blood, everything, it was assaulted. And yet when we worship, we're basically naked before God again. And that really, it's like, now what do? It's just you and Him.
Yeah.
And you got to answer to Him. Pretty scary when you think about it.
Yeah, it could be. Thankfully, it doesn't have to be.
No, we can go with Jesus and look at Him.
Yeah. Hide behind Jesus, if you will.